Alright, time to get cancelled. According to author Edith Hamilton, the fairest in the world was Helen, the daughter of Zeus and Leda, and the sister of Castor and Pollux. Such was the report of her beauty that not a young prince in Greece but wanted to marry her. The way the poets speak of Helen, it's true to say that when it comes to her beauty, they had for themselves an impossible task. How did one describe the epitome of beauty? A beauty that transcended the subjective and individual taste, and was effectively sought after and pedestalled by any man who glimpsed it. It's actually surprisingly easy. You just make it vague enough that you can't be wrong, and then hundreds of years later, you let idiots online debate about it. Thomas Bulfinch, in his Mythology, describes Helen as the fairest of her sex, implying she was the most attractive woman of all women. And naturally, as you might expect, she was not shy of marriage proposals before she had married Menelaus. Of course, if you were to take a more historical meaning of fair to mean light, then you might come away with fair-skinned, denoting Helen of Troy as being perhaps more European in appearance. In Christopher Marlowe's play Dr. Faust, the curiosity of what Helen might have looked like intrigues Faust, his fellow scholars, and perhaps even the playwright himself, for Faust is seen to be urged by his companions to summon a demon in the guise of Helen so that they might admire her. When Faust conducts the ritual, Helen emerges on stage, to which his companions praise her appearance. Was this fair Helen, whose admired worth made Greece with 10 years' war afflict poor Troy? Too simple is my wit to tell her worth, whom all the world admires for majesty. Now we have seen the pride of nature's work, we'll take our leaves, and for this blessed sight, happy and blessed be Faustus evermore. Helen's beauty evidently has such a hold of Faust that he actually later summons the demon to take her form again, so that he might make her his lover. Was this the face that launched 1,000 ships and burnt the topless towers of Ilium? Sweet Helen, make me immortal with a kiss. Her lips suck forth my soul, see where it flies. Come Helen, come give me my soul again. Here will I dwell, for heaven is in these lips, and all is dross that is not Helena. From the examples I've used, you may or may not have a clearer image of what Helen of Troy might have looked like. Of course, what people seem to forget is that Helen of Troy, as we know her from Homer's writings, wasn't a real person. So by that alone, determining what she might have looked like becomes an uphill struggle from the onset. Now I know there are some of you who believe Helen of Troy was based off of a real person, and even if that was the case, she still wouldn't have been the most beautiful person in the world, because that literally cannot be measured, and thus cannot be true. But what the hell do I know? I make videos about cat demons. However, if you thought the aforementioned sources were vague when it comes to describing Helen's appearance, then it might be because Homer, the originator of the mythology concerning Helen of Troy, didn't make things any clearer. In Book 3 of the Illiad, we see Helen very briefly described by Homer when Iris summons her to appear on the walls of Troy. It is written, "But Iris went as a messenger to white-armed Helen." Now to a modern reader, one might very easily assume that Homer is describing Helen as having white skin. Throw that in with the adjective fair by later authors, and this might be enough to solidify one's image of her. Yet there are those who argue that this is a bit of an oversimplification, and that the term white-armed is in reference not to Helen's skin, but in reference to her skin being hairless, unblemished, and clean. The white, in this sense, is then not to be taken as skin colour, but rather the connotation of the colour white, with purity, innocence, and holiness. Ergo, by this argument, white-armed Helen could simply have been a metaphor to portray Helen as being associated with these virtues. Another idea is that if white-armed Helen was used to portray the colour of her arms, it was only done to reflect her social status, that she wasn't out in the fields, thus receiving a tan, but lived a life of luxury in her palace, unperturbed by the sun. In the Basil commentary of the Iliad, it is argued that Helen's white arms were actually white elbows, and that the use of the colour white was an adjective used to characterise her beauty, not to indicate her actual skin colour. There's also mention that the white associated with her here was in regards to her social superiority amongst those who worked outdoors, who by comparison would have had dark elbows or dark arms as a result of their occupation and place within society, usually as labourers. In yet another commentary of the Iliad by Dr. Brian Hainsworth, white-armed was a common epithet to associate with women of high standing, in the same way renowned with the spear was a common epithet to associate with men of combat. Another argument I've seen put forth is that to Homer, and the audience he was writing for, there would be no need to establish Helen's skin tone, because it would have been automatically assumed that Helen and the other characters of his epic would look not so dissimilar to their own Mycenaean complexion. In essence, the Greeks were the ones who the story was written for, and so it's not out of the realm of possibility that they would have wanted the characters to have looked like themselves. An argument to contest this, however, comes from the various translations of the Odyssey, specifically the translation by A.T. Murray, where Athena restores Odysseus from his beggar disguise into his younger, more heroic appearance. Here we are told, with this Athena touched him with her golden wand. A well-washed cloak and tunic she first of all cast about his breast, and she increased his stature and his youthful bloom. Once more he grew dark of colour, and his cheeks filled out, and dark grew the beard about his chin. This would then imply that Odysseus had dark skin, rendering the idea that Homer wouldn't have mentioned skin colour somewhat incorrect. However, before everyone starts throwing their toys out the pram, it doesn't necessarily mean that Odysseus was then a person of colour. It more likely means that when he was roaming his kingdom as this old, tired beggar, it's possible his complexion was made ill, pale, or otherwise washed out, as would be expected of such a character. Yet when he is made young again, a healthy complexion is returned to his face. His flesh is effectively rejuvenated. His skin only darkens because it is returning to a tanned, vivid healthiness that one might expect of a Greek war hero. In Book 7 of the Iliad, we see Helen described once more in a somewhat roundabout way, when Paris is being urged to return Helen and her treasures back to her husband Menelaus. It is written, "Among them uprose goodly Alexander, lord of fair-haired Helen." This one is a little harder to read into and come up with something that isn't simply fair-haired. Indeed, fair-haired here may depend on the translator, but the Greek epithet is often connected with xanthos, which can mean fair, golden, tawny, reddish blonde, or simply bright. Considering these sorts of hair colours would not naturally be associated with people of colour, one might assume that Helen of Troy therefore had to have been imagined as possessing lighter skin. Another idea is that as our hair usually greys as we age, the Greek term xanthos, when used in conjunction with hair in the case of Helen, would then have to signify that Helen was not only fair-haired, but that she was at a young and prime age, or that she very much looked that way as a result of her incredible beauty. Xanthos, as we've established, could include the colour golden, so if it was applied to Helen, it could read as Helen of the golden hair, or golden-haired Helen. However, the use of this might not have been simply to confirm Helen's ethnicity or skin colour, but may have been a means to associate her with the gods, being a daughter of Zeus, and thus signifying her divine heritage. With golden hair, Helen of Troy was then not only a most striking character to look upon, but unmistakable as a descendant of the gods. This goes hand in hand with the observation by historian Bettany Hughes that the likes of Helen was described as being xanthos, golden-haired, because this was not only a way to connect mortals with the gods, but because light-haired individuals were simply less common in the ancient Mediterranean than dark-haired ones, ensuring a particular curiosity about them. Known for her lyrical poetry, all of which is now lost to history, or existing only as fragments, 5th century BC poet Sappho, in Fragment 23, writes of Helen being yellow-haired or golden-haired, but makes no effort to describe any other details about her. Scholars would argue that xanthi applies here, xanthi being the feminine form of xanthos, suggesting again that Helen, in this instance, had light hair, varying from golden to blonde to brown or even red hair. 4th century BC Greek tragedian Euripides, in his play of Helen, made a bold foray into describing Helen by detailing her hairstyle, that it was golden and curly. In a scene between Helen and Theoclymenus, Helen feigns her mourning over the death of Menelaus and demonstrates her grief in a rather performative manner by cutting her hair. Theoclymenus remarks, "Is that why you cut off curls/locks of your fair golden hair?" In his work, The Hesiodic Catalogue of Women and Archaic Greece, author Kirk Ormond noted that Helen's eyes were described with the Greek kyanios, meaning dark or even dark blue. However, author Helena Irwin, in her work Colour Terms in Greek Poetry, tells us that kyanios was likely a poetic device used to denote the colour black or brown, suggesting that Helen of Troy likely had brown or dark brown eyes. A short prose account as late as the 5th century details the perspective of Dares, a Trojan priest of Hephaestus in the Illiad. Dares gives what is purported to be a first-hand account at Troy, where he claimed to have been one of the lucky few to have seen Helen of Troy with his own eyes. Unlike other authors, Dares strays away from the modest zones of her hair and eyes, and goes rather audaciously into the realm of her body, telling us she was beautiful, ingenuous, and charming. Her legs were the best, her mouth the cutest. There was a beauty mark between her eyebrows. Considering ancient writers were seemingly struggling to come up with adequate words to explicitly portray Helen, or at least were reserved in doing so, you can only imagine the difficulty that the antiquarian artists would come to face in actually illustrating her. We only need to look at the legend of Zeuxis, a late 5th century BC artist whose work was said to have been so incredibly detailed that his illustrations were lifelike. Of course, we can't verify this because none of his works survive, but anecdotes about his work and life are plentiful. In one account, one of Zeuxis' most notable paintings was that of Helen, but he struggled to complete the piece because there simply was not a woman beautiful enough for him to pose as her. In the end, he took a total of 5 of the most beautiful women in Greece, selected their finest features, and used these to create a composite image of what he deemed to be the ideal beauty. One of the oldest surviving, clearly identifiable images of Helen is an Attic black figure amphora by an Amasis painter around 550 BC, showing Menelaus recovering Helen after the fall of Troy. In this we can see that it depicts Helen rather modestly, where she is veiled and richly dressed, adorned with jewellery, and painted brighter than the likes of Menelaus, of whom she is facing. Perhaps this is the way in which the artist chose to express her incomparable beauty, by infusing her with more colour than those around her, and marking her out to be a cut above the rest as far as physical beauty went. In a famous red figure crater from the 4th century BC, we see Menelaus on the right intent to strike Helen, but is overcome by her beauty. Eros is seen flying in between them, whilst Aphrodite can be seen on the left. You might notice not only how dark Helen's hair is in this interpretation, but also how similar she looks to the deity of love and beauty, perhaps implying that her appearance was so striking and divine that it might have even been mistaken or rivaled for the likes of a goddess. This motif of Menelaus pursuing and confronting Helen was quite popular in these vases, where artists sought to capture the hot-headedness of Menelaus being cooled by Helen's beauty and erotic power. A 3rd century BC work in the form of an Etruscan bronze mirror portrays Menelaus more victoriously seizing Helen, whilst Helen, who appears much more vulnerable and helpless, clings to a statue of Athena. Aphrodite stands behind her, whilst Thetis restrains Menelaus' sword arm, preventing him from striking. You'll notice again that, unlike the ancient writers, Helen is not shown to be fair-haired at all, but resembles the Olympian goddesses with dark hair. It's in the 1st century Pompeian wall paintings do we begin to see more vivid examples of Helen, with ancient artists dropping the coy approach and presenting Helen more intrepidly. In these examples, her xanthos hair is particularly noteworthy, where it falls into the brownish-reddish category, whilst her skin is undeniably fair or light, especially in comparison to the characters she's featured with. After late antiquity, however, Helen almost disappears from the surviving visual record for several centuries. The Ambrosian Illiad, around AD 500, preserves artwork that illustrates the Homeric cycle, but from the 6th to the 10th century, secure surviving images of Helen herself are surprisingly hard to find. By late antiquity and the early Middle Ages, the visual culture of the Mediterranean had shifted heavily toward Christian subjects, such as Christ, the Virgin Mary, various saints, biblical scenes, and church mosaics. Helen of Troy then simply belonged to the old pagan world. The big turning point is Benoit de Saint-Maur's Roman de Troyes, written around 1155 to 1160. It retold the Trojan War in medieval French, turning the ancient story into a courtly romance full of kings, queens, and knights. That text became very influential and helped create a new medieval visual tradition of Troy. An illustrated version began to circulate in the late 12th and early 13th centuries, with this spawning a reinvigorated interest in the Hellenistic world and its literary works. By the 15th century, a richly decorated manuscript of John Lygate's Siege of Troy contained 64 paintings, 2 of which showcased Helen of Troy, though these reimagine her in the English medieval style that leaves little in the way of her traditional characteristics. Another 15th century miniature from Zehan de Courcy's Chronique Universelle also depicts Helen of Troy in the English medieval style, though again it's hard to imagine her through the eyes of the Homeric audience, when she's so obviously been redrawn here for an Old English audience. It is from the 16th to the 18th century where Helen really returns as a major painted subject. The emphasis shifts away from medieval manuscript romance and toward large mythological paintings that feature aspects of capture, seduction, and the beginning of the Trojan War. One perfect example of this is the Abduction of Helen by Tintoretto in the late 16th century, which showcases the typical late Renaissance style and the efforts of Renaissance painters to bring the mythological tales to life. In this example, Helen's story becomes a theatrical scene as she is stolen by Paris, amidst a chaotic depiction of ships and soldiers. It's in such pieces that Helen is drawn as we've typically come to imagine her, with light skin, perhaps even pale when compared to other characters around her, blondish or brown hair, and dressed in royal sumptuous attire. Another example from this period that paints Helen very similarly is in Francesco Botti's Abduction of Helen, where much like Tintoretto's work, Helen is fair-haired, light-skinned, and even rosy-cheeked. By the 19th century, Helen became especially interesting because artists stopped treating her mainly as a scene in the Trojan story and started turning her into a psychological image. a beautiful woman who, depending on the artist, framed her as an enchantress, a victim, or maybe even something of a femme fatale. This becomes a moment in history where painters began to consider the beauty of Helen, and determined for themselves exactly what Helen might have looked like. Of course, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and so depending on what the artist found attractive, it would make sense that all of the depictions would have varying characteristics. Dante Gabriel Rossetti paints Helen with long golden locks and an indisputably European look, with pale skin and Western features. This was echoed by the end of the century by Evelyn de Morgan, who painted Helen with similar hair, albeit with a reddish gingery tinge, though maintaining much of the typical beauty portrayed by Rossetti. Frederick Sandys's oil painting portrays Helen in a rather vixen-esque fashion, with not only a vibrant red mane of hair, but also the scowlful expression of a spoilt child. Frederick Leighton, meanwhile, would break the mould of such long-haired beauty by opting for a short-haired Helen, an effect duplicated by John Poynter in his 1881 oil painting. So what does Helen of Troy look like? Don't know for sure. One of the true beauties of ancient texts is that two people can read the same line of a text and come up with two very different meanings. Now you can see why this is problematic with religious texts, but in texts that we've come to collectively agree as mythology, the fact that a single line can inspire such different imagery is something I feel should be celebrated. In this sense, a story can mean different things to different people. The same, I suppose, can be applied to the likes of Helen of Troy. The fact that Homer doesn't detail what the most beautiful woman in the world actually looked like beyond her white arms or fair hair allows Helen of Troy to look like virtually anyone within these constraints. Of course, if you were to interpret Helen's white arms or her fair hair differently, that is to say, if you viewed them in a manner that didn't pertain to her physical appearance, then perhaps your Helen would look even more radically different. But let me know your thoughts on what Helen of Troy looks like to you, and as always, if you've enjoyed today's episode, then don't forget to leave this video a like and subscribe for more content just like this. Until next time.